Okay, so what you have on your screen here is a list of operations down the left-hand side, starting with Operation Jubilee and finishing with Operation Shingle. And then on the top row up here, you have the principles of war. So starting with selection and maintenance of the aim and finishing with sustainability. Now what I've done here, I've colour-coded these crosses: tactical, operational and strategic. And these are the lessons that were identified and learned off the specific operations down the left-hand side. So just to run through these, you've got Operation Jubilee. This was Dieppe. You have Operation Torch. That was the invasion of North Africa. Operation Husky, invasion of Sicily. Operation Galvanic. Now this was in the Pacific and it was predominantly by the US Army and US Marine Corps, but there's an important lesson to come out of that. And then Operation Shingle. This was Anzio. Now the purpose of this slide and this little video is to outline that there are different lessons learned from all of these operations, and it wasn't just D-Day was the only amphibious op done by the Allies in the Second World War. Now this is really important to note when you compare what the Germans had to deal with when they were going to invade the UK on Operation Sea Lion. They had no experience of amphibious operations, and this was probably or partly one of the contributing factors which led to it being cancelled. They had no understanding or experience of what it entailed launching such a large amphibious op.
Okay, so the first operation I'm going to talk about is Operation Jubilee. Now that has three crosses against it: selection and maintenance of the aim, surprise and cooperation. Now you'll see that it ticks all three boxes from the strategic, operational and tactical lessons learned. But for this particular example, I'm just going to focus on selection, maintenance of the aim and surprise.
So the Dieppe raid, known as Operation Jubilee, was a disaster. And it's still a bit of a controversy to this day, especially for the Canadians who suffered the most at the beaches. However, in order to understand it properly and to articulate the issues with it would take a whole day, if not more. But what I can say is Operation Rudder was the original name for Jubilee, and then it was reincarnated after it was cancelled as Operation Jubilee with several changes to the plan. And what you also have to understand is that Operation Chariot, which was a successful commando raid on Saint-Nazaire, was a real coup, was a real high five moment for the British government. It was something to sing about, and it was one of the few successes that had occurred in the war so far. The War Office and the government decided they needed something else, they needed something similar to it. So the planners started looking at where they could go to, where could have air cover provided from the UK, where could they have an effect but not have too much of a contact or prolonged contact with the Germans. Now these factors, they all came out and they all resulted in Dieppe being chosen. And the plans for Dieppe included destroying enemy defences, destroying airfield installations, destroying the radar, removing invasion barges, and removal of secret documents from divisional headquarters at Arques. And it was also to capture prisoners. Now these were the aims of Operation Rudder. And Operation Rudder was to include infantry, airborne and armoured fighting vehicles. But, as mentioned already, Operation Rudder was cancelled. Now it was cancelled because of bad weather. However, there were 6 objectives to Operation Rudder. Now it's as if they'd planned the location and then decided what they were going to do with the location afterwards. Now this sort of leads to one of the after action review points, which was given by Lord Ismay, who, to paraphrase, said no one knew what the actual aim was of Op Jubilee because it was a copy and paste from Op Rudder onto Operation Jubilee. Now, for whatever reason, it went ahead, and that is the point which really the controversy occurs from. Whoever gave the nod for it to go, that's arguably where the blame lies. But that doesn't get away from the fact that this operation was originally driven, Operation Rudder, from the fact the government and the War Office just needed to do something. There wasn't anything tangible or specific about the op. And that's why I think selection and maintenance of the aim is one of the biggest failings of Dieppe.
The next point I'd like to raise about Jubilee is surprise. Now this was a tactical failing, and it's sort of to do with cooperation as well, but the main lesson from this was surprise. Now the flotilla set off from Newhaven towards Dieppe, and there was a convoy of 5 German torpedo boats. They were being tracked from Dover, but they fell off the radar screen as the Allied flotilla made its way to Dieppe. Anyway, around about 10 to 4 on the morning of the raid, contact was made, and the British and German ships, they physically collided. Now, this was a failing of security because there was 2 warships who were there to protect the convoy to stop this exact thing from happening. Now, unfortunately, the destroyers Slazak, which was a Polish destroyer, and the Brocklesby, which was a Royal Navy destroyer, they both heard the gunfire which erupted after these ships had collided and thought it was coming from the shore. They thought nothing of it. Now, what happened because of that collision was the German forces at Dieppe and along the coast were their alertness, their readiness state was increased. So when the flotillas finally got ashore and the troops disembarked, they were there ready to meet them, and the consequences were dire.
Operation Galvanic was one of the operations involved in the island hopping, which allowed US forces to get closer and closer to Japan. Anyhow, these island hopping operations were amphibious to start with. They had to get onto the islands. And to do this, they used Higgins boats, as you can see on your screen, and Amtraks, which are more commonly known as buffaloes, which are amphibious vehicles. Now, the maintenance of morale is an issue because during operations on Tarawa, the casualty figure was ridiculously high because the forces in the Higgins boats, those flat-bottom boats there, which were used on D-Day, were incredibly high because they got bottomed out. They were grounded on the coral reefs. This is compared with the Amtraks, which merely crawled across the top of those coral reefs because they were tracked. They didn't bottom out due to that having no draft. Now, this did affect morale because you had some of the forces equipped with Higgins boats and they suffered terribly, and some of the forces equipped with Amtraks and they didn't suffer so bad. So that's just an indication of maintenance morale as a result of poor planning or just a lack of consideration. Now, on a side note, Amtraks were available for D-Day, but they were not used. And it is, again, a contested subject. Why weren't they used? Nobody really knows. But there you go. The difference between equipment resulted in maintenance morale being an issue.
So to highlight offensive action or lack of, I'd like to use Operation Shingle. Now, on Operation Shingle, which were the landings at Anzio on the 22nd of January 1944, this is only 6 months before D-Day. The forces landed and there were rarely, there was some contest, but not much for contest. One of the American officers managed to drive his Jeep into the centre of Rome. He went on a sightseeing tour. He saw the Colosseum and then he reported back to his lines. And, this information got passed up, but the general of the day did nothing about it. He stayed where he was. This resulted in the forces becoming beached. They literally got stuck in Anzio and they were slowed down for no other reason than their failure to think offensively. They're being overcautious. Now, this might have been coloured by Operation Husky or previous experience, but either way, the forces there, if they'd realised that there was nothing in their way between landing on the beachhead in Rome, they could have moved very quickly and bought themselves time and stopped the Germans from being able to organise and mount an effective counterattack and defence to all those forces landing at Anzio.
Okay, so I'd like to use Operation Torch as an example of security. Now, security is a strange principle of war, and it's not just about having your secret documents locked away in a safe every night. Security is about the security of your plan. Is your plan susceptible to flank attack? Is it susceptible to artillery, to air attack, and that sort of thing? Now, the example I'd like to use from Operation Torch is when 2 Royal Navy cutters, which had been requisitioned from the US Coast Guard, they were called the Walney and the Heartland, they tried to ram their way, they tried to force their way into one of the harbours in Algeria. Now, pretty reckless if you ask me. There was no air defence. There was very little in the form of operations to destroy the coastal batteries. And because of this, only 4 sailors from the Walney itself survived after it was sunk. So, I think that might have been inspired by Operation Chariot with the raid at Saint-Nazaire, but it was pretty reckless and there wasn't that much, there was no surprise in that, which resulted in the element being lost, which meant security would have been vital, to provide protection for HMS Walney, but it didn't happen, and that's the point I'd like to raise about security.
So the next one I'd like to talk about is concentration of force, and again I'll be using Operation Shingle, those landings which took place at Anzio in Italy. Now it is linked to the previous point about Operation Shingle, that of offensive action. Now this is because the lack of offensive action, which, the Jeep managed to roll into the centre of Rome unopposed, if that was followed up with concentration of force, then there really could have been some gains made. Now, unfortunately, when those forces landed, the Allied commanders, they just sat there. They didn't do anything because there was no real plan of what to do next, which I suppose links to another point, selection and maintenance of the aim.
Just sat there creating a beachhead. There was no thrust, there was no concentration of force at an apparent weak point. And this, as you're starting to see, is linked to the other principles of war. Because there was a lack of offensive action, because there was a lack of flexibility, we'll talk about later, this resulted in no concentration of force, which could have exploited a fleeting opportunity. Now, we'll talk about it a bit later, but the consequences of doing that resulted in further casualties and Operation Shingle nearly becoming a failure. Okay, so I'm going to use Operation Husky, which was the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, to talk about economy of effort and cooperation. So two birds with one stone here. So economy of effort, there was a failing of this after the initial landings of Sicily, when Montgomery, when he was travelling northwards, came under fierce resistance, or fiercer than expected resistance, at a place called Catania. Excuse my Italian there. Now, what happened was they were fixed. There was a choke point. There was panzers. They couldn't break through. But there was no way for Montgomery to call on extra forces for two reasons. There was inter-service and international rivalries between Montgomery and his American counterpart. He didn't want to ask for extra troops. So that's one example of economy of effort, not being adhered to. If he was able to cooperate, then he could have, got some more forces, moved them to where he was, and perhaps broken through at Catania. Now, the problem you had was, because he was held up there, the Germans were able to do a mini Dunkirk, or, well, it wasn't particularly mini, because they were able to evacuate 45,000 German troops to mainland Italy. And these troops, and no doubt, played a further part in the war, particularly as discussed after Op Shingle, when they ran into resistance at the Gustav Line. But because they were held up, because there was a lack of cooperation, and this resulted in a lack of economy of effort, they were really held up. So at the tactical level, though, with cooperation, one of the reasons why you see aircraft depicted with black and white stripes in the Second World War, particularly on D-Day, is a direct lesson from Operation Husky. This is because 25 aircraft were shot down by naval ships when they were mistaken to be German. This is because the naval ships sent out radio signals to these aircraft to say, look, are you such and such, identify yourself. But the aircraft had just been fitted with new radios, so they weren't able to identify themselves. And rightly so, the naval ships opened fire and sadly killed hundreds of paratroopers and airmen. So that's economy of effort and cooperation linked to Op Husky. So the example I'm going to use to highlight flexibility or lack of flexibility is Op Shingle. Again, this was only 6 months before D-Day. And I think you can guess where I'm going to go with this. Now, the orders were to land at Anzio and create a beachhead. And that's exactly what the commander did. Despite someone being able to drive into Rome, which was, not just up the road, it was quite some way from Anzio. He was able to drive up there unimpeded in his Jeep, see the Colosseum, report back. There was no movement on the plan. There could have been a thrust forward, they could have gained some ground, but no, they stayed in Anzio, and the battle became a long, drawn-out affair over 6 weeks, where, the forces, they were contained by the Germans. They weren't thrown back in the sea, so it wasn't a complete failure. but they were contained and stalled for 6 weeks. And it was Churchill who basically said words to the effect that he'd hoped for a wildcat to be slung ashore, but instead he's got a beached whale. And that is a prime example of a lack of flexibility in a plan. And the final principle of war I'm going to talk about is sustainability. And I'm only going to focus on Operation Torch for this one. And it is definitely at the strategic level. Now, Operation Torch, like I said, it was the first major operation for US forces in Europe. And as such, lots of lessons were learned from it. Now, there was also a lot of politics which went on with it as well, including French troops refusing to fight under British command, and they would only fight under American command. But that's another topic for another time. Anyhow, back to sustainability. Now, there was a real focus on getting ashore. It was all about the combat arms, combat teeth, getting ashore, and winning that initial fight. And there was very little attention paid to sustainability, and particularly logistics and resupply. Now, the terrain going inland of Algeria is particularly hilly, with narrow roads, limited rail network, and this was overlooked or it was ignored by the planners. For instance, there was only one rail route, and that took 7 days for supplies to get from the S-Pod to the front line. And in addition, it got so critical with the lack of sustainability, the airborne troops who had landed in there found themselves licking cactuses to get water, and they only had 100 rounds per man. However, somehow they managed to survive. Now, this perhaps was further compounded by the force ratios. A lot of support and service troops, which is what they call combat service support, were stripped out in favour of combat troops. So, there's plenty of bayonets and what have you, but there wasn't enough service support there. And I believe that is one of the key lessons which was learned in D-Day planning and the aftermath. And you'll see that with where the beaches were chosen and what the objectives were. So there's a quick run through of the principles of war in relation to operations between 1942 and 1944. And it just goes to show that D-Day wasn't the Allies' first rodeo. They'd had lots of experience right from the minute that they'd been kicked off mainland Europe in the summer of 1940, right up until D-Day. So you had all the operations in the Pacific, you had all the operations in the Mediterranean, as well as the commando raids. So I look forward to exploring and discussing the principles of war and other principles such as defence with you in Normandy.